These pictures were in watercolors. The first represented clouds low and livid, rolling over a swollen sea. All the distance was an eclipse. So, too, was the foreground, or rather, the nearest billows, for there was no land. One gleam of light lifted into relief a half-submerged mass on which sat a cormorant, dark and large, with wings flecked with foam. Its beak held a golden bracelet set with gems that I had touched with as brilliant tints as my palette could yield, and as glittering distinctness as my pencil could impart. Sinking below the bird and the mast, a drowned corpse glanced through the green water. A fair arm was the only limb clearly visible, whence the bracelet had been washed or torn. So this is a description of what she drew. She drew a corpse. Not super common for an 18-year-old girl to paint a corpse, right? So this could reveal her psychological well-being or her thoughts and inner personality. The second picture contained for foreground only the dim peak of a hill, with grass and some leaves slanting as if by a breeze. Beyond and above spread an expanse of sky, dark blue as at twilight. Rising into the sky was a woman shaped to the bust, portrayed in tints as dusk and soft as I could combine. The dim forehead was crowned with a star. The lineaments were below were seen as through the suffusion of vapor. The eyes shone dark and wild. The hair streamed shadowy, like a beamless cloud torn by storm or by electric travail. On the neck lay a pale reflection like moonlight. Some faint luster touched the train of thin clouds from which rose and bowed this vision of the evening star. So this is a romantic image because this is basically the romantic movement of poetry as well. So, which talks about imagery and scenery and nature, the pastoral, that kind of thing. The third showed the pinnacle of an iceberg piercing a polar winter sky. A muster of northern lights reared their dim lances, close serried along the horizon. Throwing these into the distance rose, in the foreground, a head, a colossal head, inclined towards the iceberg and resting against it. Two thin hands, joined under their forehead and supporting it, drew up before the lower features a sable veil, a brow quite bloodless, white as bone, and an eye hollow and fixed, blank of meaning, but for the glassiness of despair, alone were visible. Above the temples, amidst wreath turbaned folds of black drapery, vague in its character and consistency as cloud, gleamed a ring of white flame, gemmed with sparkles of a more lurid tinge. This pale crescent was the likeness of a kingly crown. What it diademed was the shape which shape had none. "Were you happy when you painted these pictures?" asked Mr. Rochester presently, which is a good question to ask because it's not very, happy-go-lucky imagery. "I was absorbed, sir. Yes, and I was happy. To paint them, in short, was to enjoy one of the keenest pleasures I have ever known." "That is not saying much. Your pleasures, by your own account, have been very few, but I dare say you did exist in a kind of artist's dreamland while you blent and arranged these strange tints. Did you sit at them long each day?" "I had nothing else to do because it was the vacation, and I sat at them from morning till noon, and from noon till night, the length of midsummer days favored my inclination to apply." "And you felt satisfied with the result of your ardent labors?" "Far from it. I was tormented by the contrast between my idea and my handiwork. In each case I had imagined something which I was quite powerless to realize." "Not quite. You have secured the shadow of your thought, but no more probably. You had not enough of the artist's skill and science to give it full being, yet the drawings are, for a schoolgirl, peculiar. As to the thoughts, they are elfish. These eyes in the evening star you must have seen in a dream. How could you make them look so clear and yet not at all brilliant? For the planet above quells their rays. And what meaning is that in their solemn depth? And who taught you to paint wind? There is a high gale in that sky and on this hilltop. Where did you see Latmos? For that is Latmos. There, put the drawings away." So he's kind of critical, but also praising her. Annie calls her an elf, like that recurrent motif of the mythological, which is, I find interesting. Maybe you guys don't, but I do. I had scarce tied the strings of the portfolio when, looking at his watch, he said abruptly, "It is 9 o'clock. What are you about, Miss Eyre, to let Adele sit up so long? Take her to bed." Adele went to kiss him before quitting the room. He endured the caress, but scarcely seemed to relish it more than Pilate would have done, nor so much. "I wish you all good night now," said he, making a movement of the hand towards the door, in token that he was tired of our company and wished to dismiss us. Miss Fairfax folded up her knitting. Woohoo! I took my portfolio. We curtsied to him, received a frigid bow in return, and so withdrew. You said Mr. Rochester was not strikingly peculiar, Mrs. Fairfax, I observed, when I rejoined her in her room after putting Adele to bed. Well, is he? I think so. He is very changeful and abrupt. True, no doubt he may appear so to a stranger, but I'm so accustomed to his manner, I never think of it. And then, if he has peculiarities of temper, allowances should be made. Why? Partly because it is his nature, and we can none of us help our nature, which is a human universal truth. And partly because he has painful thoughts, no doubt, to harass him, to make his spirits unequal. What about? Family troubles, for one thing. But he has no family. Not now, but he has had, or at least relatives. He lost his elder brother a few years since. His elder brother? Yes. The present Mr. Rochester has not been very long in possession of the property, only about 9 years. 9 years is a tolerable time. Was he so very fond of his brother as to still be inconsolable for his loss? Why, no, perhaps not. I believe there were some misunderstandings between them. Mr. Rowland Rochester was not quite just to Mr. Edward, and perhaps he prejudiced his father against him. The old gentleman was fond of money and anxious to keep the family estate together. He did not like to diminish the property by division, and yet he was anxious that Mr. Edward should have wealth too, to keep up the consequence of the name. And soon after he was of age, some steps were taken that were not quite fair and made a great deal of mischief. So something about getting the current Mr. Rochester, Edward, money, but it wasn't in the best way. And so that's kind of foreshadowing or hinting at something that we'll find out later. Old Mr. Rochester and Mr. Rowland combined to bring Mr. Edward into what he considered a painful position for the sake of making his fortune. What the precise nature of that position was, I never clearly knew, but his spirit could not brook what he had to suffer in it. He is not very forgiving. He broke with his family, and now for many years he has led an unsettled kind of life. I don't think he has ever been resident at Thornfield for a fortnight together since the death of his brother, without a will left him master of the estate, and indeed no wonder he shuns the old place. Why should he shun it? Perhaps he thinks it is gloomy. The answer was evasive. I should have liked something clearer, but Miss Fairfax either could not or would not give me more explicit information of the origin and nature of Mr. Rochester's trials. She averred that they were a mystery to herself, and that what she knew was chiefly from conjecture. It was evident, indeed, that she wished me to drop the subject, which I did accordingly.